In 2029, the world was buzzing with the usual news. Scientists discovering new particles, astronauts returning from space, and debates about the latest technological breakthroughs. But something truly unexpected happened in a small, almost forgotten, part of the world, something that would forever change humanity's place in the universe. Dr. Elsie Navarro, a young astrophysicist, worked in a modest observatory in Chile. Unlike the massive, well-funded space agencies in the United States and Russia, Elsie's team had to make do with old equipment and limited resources. It wasn't glamorous, but Elsie was passionate about her work. Every night, she'd sit at her desk, looking through data collected by the observatory's massive radio telescopes. They were meant to study distant stars and galaxies, but Elsie always had a secret hope that one day, she'd hear something more, that one signal that could prove we weren't alone. One evening, as Elsie sifted through a new batch of data, her eyes froze on the screen. There it was, a strange repeating signal. It didn't look like the usual cosmic noise. It was too regular, too purposeful. Most astronomers would have dismissed it as just another glitch in the system, but Elsie had a feeling. She spent hours, then days, analyzing the signal, trying to make sense of it. The signal came in regular bursts, almost like a rhythm, and each burst was slightly different from the last. It didn't fit any known pattern of natural phenomena, like stars or black holes emitting radio waves. No, this was something deliberate, something intelligent. Elsie couldn't believe it. She quickly contacted her team. "Come look at this," she wrote in the email, her fingers trembling as she hit send. Her colleagues didn't respond right away. After all, it was probably just another piece of space debris interfering with the instruments. But Elsie didn't give up. She kept watching the signals, night after night. And then she did something no one had expected. She decided to decode it. After weeks of analyzing and testing, Elsie discovered a pattern hidden in the signals. It was like a code, a strange language of numbers and frequencies that repeated itself, in specific ways. It was something she had seen in theory before, patterns in radio waves that could potentially be a message from an alien civilization. But this was no theory. This was real. Elsie's heart raced. Was this an alien signal? Could this be the moment humanity had been waiting for? She didn't know, but there was no way she could ignore it. She had to know what it meant. The moment she started to work on decoding the message, the media began picking up on the story. The idea of aliens reaching out to humanity was too big to ignore. News stations in different countries broadcast the story, even though most scientists, especially those in government and well-funded space agencies, dismissed it. Just noise, they said. Don't get excited over nothing. But Elsie wasn't deterred. She believed in what she was seeing. And as the days passed, her initial excitement turned into an obsession. She worked tirelessly, sleeping only a few hours each night, as she pieced together the message. It wasn't easy. The code was complex, and there were many parts that didn't make sense. But Elsie was determined. With each breakthrough, the message became clearer. Finally, after weeks of hard work, Elsie managed to decipher the first part of the message. It was a simple greeting, but its meaning was unmistakable. The aliens were communicating, reaching out across the vastness of space, and they had one urgent message. Help. Elsie's breath caught in her chest. It wasn't just a simple, hello. The signal wasn't some kind of grand scientific discovery or an intellectual exercise. The aliens were in trouble. They were asking for help. The message was filled with images of strange symbols and designs, showing a civilization in distress. There were images of cities, once magnificent, now destroyed. There were signs of what seemed like a dying planet, scorched skies, barren landscapes, and oceans that had long since dried up. The message was clear. The aliens were on the brink of extinction. Their world was falling apart, and they needed help. But they weren't just reaching out for any kind of assistance. They needed knowledge. They needed a civilization that could offer them a way out of their crisis. Elsie stared at the screen, unable to process what she was reading. She had always dreamed of finding life beyond Earth, But this was more than she had ever expected. The message was heartbreaking. These aliens, whoever they were pleading for help. And it wasn't just a cry for attention. It was a desperate, final attempt to survive. But as the weeks passed and Elsie began sharing the details with the scientific community, she realized something strange. No one seemed to care. While there was some initial excitement, it quickly fizzled out. The world's top scientists and governments weren't interested. They weren't even willing to take the alien message seriously. The reactions ranged from dismissive to outright hostile. The most common response was that it was just another piece of space debris, a mistake, something that could be explained away with conventional science. Elsie was devastated. She had been working tirelessly, pouring her heart and soul into something that she believed could change the course of human history. And yet the world seemed to ignore it. No one was willing to listen to what she had found. But Elsie refused to give up. She was determined to get the message out. She couldn't just turn her back on the aliens who were in such desperate need. As more time passed, Elsie began to realize the magnitude of the situation. If the signal was real, then humanity was faced with an incredible opportunity. This was not just some random signal from space. It was a chance to answer the call of another civilization. A chance to make contact with an alien species that had survived long enough to send out this plea for help. One night, as Elsie sat alone in her observatory, she made a decision. She would respond. She would send a message back to the aliens, telling them that humanity was listening. She would tell them that she believed in the message and that she would not ignore their plea for help. The next few days were a blur as Elsie and her small team worked feverishly to construct a response. They didn't have the resources of a government agency, but they had determination, and sometimes that was enough. Using the same old Cold War-era equipment that had been gathering dust in the back of the observatory, they sent their first message, back to the aliens. It wasn't a grand, powerful response. It wasn't filled with promises of rescue or a fleet of spaceships. Instead, it was simply a message that said, "We hear you. We are listening." It was the first step, and it was a step that would take humanity on a journey into the unknown, a journey that would change everything. As the weeks passed after Elsie Navarro sent the first response to the mysterious alien distress signal, something incredible happened. At first, the world barely paid attention. The media, as expected, moved on to other stories. The signal from space, though important to Elsie and her team, was quickly dismissed by the global scientific community. After all, no one could prove the signal wasn't just a random burst of static from space. And yet, Elsie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important buried in those strange, repeating patterns. Then one night, something changed. It was subtle at first. A faint hum that turned into a steady, rhythmic pulse from the observatory's old radio equipment. Elsie was working late, her mind buzzing with the possibilities of what might happen next. She had never expected to hear anything back so quickly, but the signal came through clearly once again, more powerful and focused than before. It was the aliens. They were answering. Elsie felt a rush of excitement that overwhelmed any doubts. The pattern in the signal was the same, but this time it was clearer, sharper. She quickly began to decode it, her fingers dancing over the keyboard as she worked to understand the message. At first, she thought it was just a repeat of the initial cry for help. But as the code continued to reveal itself, Elsie realized it was far more than that. The aliens weren't just asking for help anymore. They were telling their story. The first part of the new message came through like an ancient cry, images of a dying world. Elsie could see shattered cities, vast oceans that had turned to dry, cracked earth, and skies filled with what looked like massive storms. It wasn't just the physical destruction that sent a chill down her spine. It was the sense of loss, the emotional weight behind the images. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was something worse. It was a civilization in its final days. The aliens' planet, once full of life and energy, was now crumbling. Their advanced technology, which had once allowed them to control their environment, had turned against them. The planet's ecosystems had collapsed under the strain of overuse, their resources depleted, and their once thriving cities were now nothing but ruins. But in the midst of this destruction, one thing stood out. The message was full of emotion. It wasn't just a distress call. It was a cry for understanding, a desire to be heard. As Elsie continued to decode the signal, she realized that the aliens weren't just asking for rescue. They were asking for something deeper, empathy. They didn't want just technology or a cure for their dying planet. They wanted someone, anyone, to know what had happened to them, to understand the mistakes they had made. The more Elsie decoded, the clearer it became. The aliens, a species called the Ilari, had once been a proud and noble race. They had advanced in science and culture to a level that was unimaginable to humanity. They had traveled across the stars, creating colonies on distant worlds, mastering technologies that allowed them to manipulate their environment. But in their pursuit of progress, they had made one crucial mistake. They ignored the balance of their planet. They exploited its resources without considering the long-term consequences. Their technology, which had been their greatest achievement, had become their undoing. The Ilari had a deep understanding of the universe. They had looked to the stars for answers, just as humanity had. But their reliance on technology and their blind ambition had led to their downfall. Now, all they had left was their message, a desperate attempt to reach out before their civilization was gone forever. Elsie couldn't believe what she was reading. The Ilari were not like the cold, emotionless aliens that many had imagined. They were just like humans in so many ways. They had dreams, hopes, and fears. They had made mistakes just like humanity had, and now they were asking for help in a way that was deeply personal. The next part of the message was even more surprising. The Ilari offered a gift, a technological breakthrough that they had been working on for centuries, one that could change everything for humanity. It was a way to preserve knowledge, a kind of living archive that could store the history and culture of an entire civilization. This archive wasn't just a piece of technology, it was a living organism, a symbiotic network of biological and digital memory that could grow and adapt over time. The Ilari had developed it as a way to ensure that their civilization's history would live on, even after they were gone. Elsie was stunned. The aliens were offering humanity the key to preserving their own history, their knowledge, and their culture. It was a gift, but it was also a warning. The Ilari had made the mistake of ignoring the delicate balance between technology and nature, and now they were offering humanity a chance to learn from their mistakes. At first, Elsie wasn't sure how to respond. This was too big to process. It wasn't just a scientific discovery, it was a moral dilemma. Could humanity accept the gift of knowledge from a dying civilization? Was it wise to accept something from beings who had made the mistakes they had? But as she thought about it more, Elsie realized that the gift wasn't just about the technology. It was about the message behind it. The Ilari were asking humanity to understand their story, not just to learn from their mistakes, but to ensure that humanity wouldn't make the same errors. As Elsie shared the decoded message with the rest of the world, a new wave of excitement and fear swept over the planet. The alien distress signal, which had once been dismissed as noise, was now something that could change everything. Governments, scientists, and ordinary people were all drawn into the conversation. Some feared the implications of the message. What if the aliens were trying to manipulate humanity? What if the technology they offered came with dangerous consequences? But for Elsie, the message was clear. This was an opportunity to learn, to connect with another civilization on a deeper level, and to ensure that humanity's future wouldn't be tainted by the same mistakes that the Ilari had made. While the world argued about what to do next, Elsie knew that the first step had already been taken. The aliens had reached out, and now it was humanity's turn to respond. The next stage would not be easy. The world would need to come together to make a decision. Should they accept the Ilari's gift? Could humanity be trusted with such advanced knowledge? Would they be able to use it wisely? As Elsie sat in the quiet of her observatory, staring at the final transmission from the Ilari, she realized one thing. The future of humanity was no longer in its own hands. It was in the hands of those who were brave enough to answer the call, and no matter what happened, humanity would never be the same again. This second part of the story introduces the emotional and philosophical complexity of the aliens' distress call. It shows how humanity begins to truly understand the significance of the message, and how they must decide whether or not to accept the gift the aliens offer. The theme of learning from past mistakes and the importance of empathy and wisdom is explored, setting the stage for humanity's response to the alien civilization's desperate plea. As the message from the Alari continued to spread across the globe, a wave of emotions swept over the world. People were no longer just curious or excited about the idea of aliens, they were deeply moved by the Alari's story. The message wasn't just about technology or survival. It was a call to humanity to learn from their mistakes, to understand the delicate balance between progress and destruction, and to approach the future with caution and empathy. Elsie Navarro, who had been at the center of this discovery, was overwhelmed by the weight of what was happening. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the future of humanity. The world was divided, torn between those who wanted to accept the Alari's gift and those who feared the consequences. But no matter the doubts and fears, one thing was certain. Humanity had to make a decision. At first, the debate was messy and chaotic. World leaders, scientists, and religious figures spoke out, each with their own opinions on the alien message. Some believed that accepting the Alari's technology would be the greatest opportunity in human history. It could solve the world's most pressing issues: energy shortages, environmental destruction, even space travel. But others feared that it could bring even more harm than good. What if the technology was too dangerous? What if the Alari had failed because they had misused their own advancements? In the midst of this confusion, a strange thing happened. While the politicians argued and the scientists debated, ordinary people began to take notice. Across the world, in classrooms, libraries, and cafes, discussions about the Alari message started to spark. Students in universities were the first to dive deep into the question of whether humanity should accept the aliens' gift. They analyzed the data, they researched the potential consequences, and they began to see the message from a different perspective. For many, it wasn't just about technology, it was about understanding another culture, another civilization that had lived through their own mistakes. One student, a young coder from Japan named Haruki, became one of the leading figures in deciphering the deeper meanings behind the Alari's message. He was autistic, and his mind worked differently from others. He was able to notice patterns in the alien signal that no one else had. After weeks of working with the data, Haruki discovered something extraordinary. The Alari weren't just telling their story, they were offering a chance for humanity to prevent a similar fate. Their technology, the living archive, wasn't just a way to preserve knowledge. It was a way to learn from the past and to ensure that history wasn't forgotten. The Alari's message was not just a warning, it was a gift, a chance to grow, to evolve, and to avoid the mistakes they had made. Haruki's discovery sparked a new movement. Ordinary people, young and old, across the world started to see the potential in the Alari's message. They began to understand that this wasn't just about receiving alien technology, it was about becoming better, about understanding how to live in balance with the world around them. As the news spread about Haruki's breakthrough, other voices began to join the conversation. Artists, poets, and philosophers weighed in. They saw the message as a profound philosophical question. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to learn from the past? The Alari weren't just asking for help. They were asking humanity to evolve, to look beyond the surface of their own problems and recognize the larger universal forces at play. Their plea wasn't just about saving their species, it was about saving humanity from repeating the same mistakes. In the months that followed, the debate grew even more intense. But as the world continued to argue, the pressure to make a decision grew. The Alari were waiting. They had already given humanity a glimpse of their knowledge, but now they wanted to know if humanity was ready to accept their offer. And so, A global vote was announced. Every nation on Earth would have a say in whether or not to accept the Alaris gift. The world would decide. Elsie watched all of this unfold with a sense of awe. She had never imagined that something she had discovered, something so simple, so pure, could become a global event. People were finally listening, not just to the aliens, but to each other. They were thinking deeply about their own world, their own future. The vote came down to a simple question. Should humanity accept the Alaris living archive, their final gift of knowledge? The decision wasn't just about science or technology. It was about the kind of future humanity wanted. Would they accept the chance to learn from the Alaris' mistakes? Or would they turn their backs on this opportunity out of fear? As the vote began, Elsie and her team gathered in the observatory. They watched as the numbers came in, as countries cast their votes. It was tense. Nobody knew what the result would be. But as the final votes were counted, something unexpected happened. The majority of the world's population had voted to accept the Alaris gift. It was a victory for hope. It was a victory for those who believed that humanity could learn, grow, and evolve. But it was also a heavy responsibility. Accepting the gift wasn't just about receiving knowledge. It was about using that knowledge wisely. The world now had to figure out how to integrate the Alaris technology into their own society, how to avoid the same mistakes that had led to the Alaris' downfall. The decision to accept the Alaris' gift was just the beginning. The next step would be to build the infrastructure necessary to house and protect the living archive. A team of scientists and engineers was assembled, and work began on a facility in Antarctica, far from the reach of any political or environmental instability. This facility would be where the Alaris' living archive would be stored, where the knowledge of an entire civilization would be kept safe. As the project progressed, Elsie found herself at the forefront of a new chapter in human history. It was a humbling experience. She had spent so many years trying to prove herself in the scientific community, but now she realized that her true role was not just as a scientist, but as a bridge between two worlds. She had helped bring humanity to the point where it could accept the responsibility of knowledge that was far beyond anything they had ever imagined. The Alaris' archive, once completed, was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. It wasn't a hard drive or a digital file. It was a living organism. It grew and adapted, storing information not just in data but in experiences, in feelings, in memories. It was a biological and digital symbiosis that allowed for a deeper understanding of the past, of the mistakes that had been made, and of the potential for a better future. But as humanity began to learn from the Alaris, they realized that this was just the first step. The real challenge would be to ensure that their civilization wouldn't fall into the same traps that had led to the Alaris' destruction. They had to learn how to balance progress with sustainability, how to use technology, without losing sight of the natural world. Elsie watched as the first wave of data from the Alaris' archive began to flow into Earth systems. It was overwhelming. So much knowledge, so much history all at once. But despite the enormity of it, there was hope. Humanity was learning, and that was what mattered most. In the end, it wasn't just about the gift of technology. It was about the willingness to listen, to learn, and to grow. The Alaris had offered humanity a chance, not just to survive, but to thrive. And now, it was up to humanity to prove that they were worthy of that chance. This part of the story emphasizes the human journey of decision-making and the collective realization that the future must be shaped by empathy, understanding, and a commitment to learning from the past. It explores how ordinary people, like Haruki, become the driving force behind humanity's choice, highlighting the power of grassroots movements in shaping history. It also introduces the concept of responsibility, as humanity must now handle the Alaris' gift of knowledge with care, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. Months after humanity accepted the Alaris' gift, the world began to change. The living archive, housed in a massive facility in Antarctica, was quickly becoming a symbol of hope and a reminder of the delicate balance between progress and preservation. It was an extraordinary project, a testament to humanity's willingness to learn from the past. However, as more and more knowledge from the Ilari poured in, the challenges became clearer. The question wasn't whether humanity could handle this knowledge. It was whether humanity was ready for the responsibility it entailed. The living archive was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was an organism, alive in a way that no one had expected. The archive didn't just store information, it experienced it. As the data was fed into it, the organism seemed to grow, shifting and adapting to the new influx of knowledge. It had a kind of awareness, a quiet presence that felt as though it were watching and learning right alongside humanity. The team of scientists, engineers, and philosophers who worked at the facility were in awe of what they had created. But as the months passed, a quiet tension began to grow. The archive was teaching them things, but it was also revealing uncomfortable truths about humanity's own existence. Some of these truths were troubling. It became clear that the mistakes the Ilari had made were eerily similar to those humanity was already repeating. One of the first lessons humanity learned from the archive was the Ilari's story of how they had fallen. Their society had been built on the pursuit of progress without understanding the true cost. They had developed advanced technologies that allowed them to manipulate their environment, but they had also exploited their planet's resources without any regard for the long-term consequences. Their world, once vibrant with life, had turned into a barren wasteland. They had built massive cities, but at the expense of the very ecosystems that sustained them. The archive showed images of the Ilari's thriving cities, towering skyscrapers of metal and glass, gardens of floating plants, and artificial rivers that flowed with the purest water. But all of it had been wiped out. The archive played out the history of their downfall, a warning to humanity about what could happen if they continued down the same path. The Ilari had been so focused on achieving greatness that they had ignored the fragile balance of life on their planet. Now their civilization was gone, leaving only their memory and their final plea for help. At first, humanity was shocked by these revelations. People couldn't help but see the similarities between the Ilari's fate and their own. How often had humanity placed technology above nature? How often had they used the Earth's resources without considering the future? The archive made it clear that these were not questions of if, but of when. If humanity didn't change, they too could fall into the same trap. This realization sparked an intense global conversation. It wasn't just scientists who were grappling with these questions, it was everyone. Political leaders, business executives, farmers, and ordinary citizens all began to reconsider their way of life. They began to ask themselves, how could humanity avoid the same mistakes that led to the Ilari's collapse? How could they balance progress with sustainability? Some people saw the Ilari's downfall as a warning, a clear sign that humanity needed to stop its reckless pursuit of progress. They advocated for a return to simpler, more sustainable ways of life. Renewable energy, conservation, and small-scale farming were suddenly more popular than ever. They called for a global movement to reduce consumption and shift focus away from technology and growth for growth's sake. For many, this idea resonated with a growing sense that the world was moving too fast, that people had become too detached from the environment, and that the natural world was being sacrificed for convenience and profit. But not everyone agreed. There were many who saw the lessons from the Ilari as a reason to accelerate technological innovation. They argued that the Ilari had failed because they hadn't fully developed their technology to solve their problems. Humanity, they believed, could avoid the same fate by continuing to advance. They proposed a new age of exploration and innovation, where humans could develop new technologies to reverse the damage they had already done to the planet. Climate change, pollution, and resource depletion could all be solved with the right technology, they argued. The debate became a defining issue of the era. The knowledge from the Ilari had forced humanity to confront the uncomfortable truth about the cost of their progress. The archive didn't provide easy answers. It simply asked the hard questions, forcing humanity to choose between two paths. One that embraced sustainability and caution, and one that relied on the continued expansion of technology. In the midst of this debate, Elsie Navarro found herself at the heart of the conversation. She had spent her life working to uncover the mysteries of the universe, and now she was faced with the greatest mystery of all. What would humanity do with the knowledge they had been given? As one of the leading scientists working on the living archive, Elsie had seen firsthand how powerful and dangerous this new knowledge could be. The Ilari's technology was far beyond anything humanity had ever developed. It offered the potential for limitless energy, advanced medical treatments, and even ways to reverse environmental damage. But at what cost? What would humanity sacrifice in the pursuit of such power? Elsie didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing: humanity had to approach the knowledge with caution. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about learning how to live in balance with the world around them. The Ilari had failed because they had ignored the delicate relationship between technology and nature. Humanity couldn't make the same mistake. As the global debate continued, the United Nations called for a summit, a global meeting to discuss how humanity should proceed with the Ilari's knowledge. The summit brought together world leaders, scientists, environmentalists, and technologists. It was an unprecedented gathering, one that would shape the future of humanity for generations to come. The summit was tense. There were heated arguments about how to balance progress with sustainability. Some leaders wanted to use the Ilari's technology to solve immediate problems: climate change, poverty, and disease. Others feared that humanity wasn't ready for such power and wanted to focus on smaller, more sustainable solutions. The room was divided, and no one seemed to agree on the best course of action. It was during one of these debates that a surprising voice spoke up: Haruki, the young coder from Japan who had been pivotal in decoding the Ilari's message. Haruki had spent months studying the data from the archive, and his perspective was unlike anyone else's. He wasn't a political leader, nor was he a scientist with decades of experience. He was an ordinary person who had been deeply moved by the Ilari's story. Standing before the assembly, Haruki spoke simply but passionately. The Ilari were not destroyed by their technology. They were destroyed by their inability to understand themselves. Their greatest mistake wasn't the machines they built. It was their belief that they could control everything. They didn't understand that they were part of the world, not above it. They didn't respect the natural balance. Haruki's words struck a chord. It wasn't just about the technology. It was about the mindset that came with it. The Ilari had seen themselves as masters of the universe, able to control everything. But in doing so, they had lost their connection to the world that supported them. Humanity had the chance to avoid that mistake, but it required a new way of thinking. It wasn't just about using technology to fix problems. It was about using technology in harmony with nature, in a way that respected the fragile balance of life. Haruki's speech sparked a new wave of conversation. People began to realize that the Ilari's downfall was not just a warning about technology, it was a warning about the dangers of hubris. Humanity needed to humble itself and recognize that they were part of the ecosystem, not separate from. And the summit ended with a decision that would change the course of history. The world agreed to a new approach, a sustainable innovation model that would prioritize balance over unchecked progress. The Ilari's technology would be used, but with great care and respect for the environment. A global effort would be launched to develop sustainable technologies that could help repair the damage done to the planet while avoiding the mistakes the Ilari had made. Elsie, Haruki, and many others would work tirelessly to ensure that the future humanity built would not repeat the same mistakes of the past. The knowledge from the Ilari had opened humanity's eyes to the true nature of their existence. They were no longer just a species on a quest for power and progress. They were a part of a larger, interconnected world, and they had a responsibility to protect it. The journey was far from over. There were still many challenges ahead. But, for the first time in history, humanity was ready to take the lessons from the Ilari seriously. They understood that their survival depended not just on technology, but on how they used it, and that the future they built would be one of balance, empathy, and wisdom. As humanity continued its journey with the Ilari's knowledge, the world began to shift. The initial excitement and wonder had given way to a deeper understanding of the responsibility they had undertaken. The Alari's technology was powerful, but it was not a quick fix. It required patience, careful planning, and, most importantly, a collective effort from every corner of the globe. The lessons humanity had learned from the Alari were not just about avoiding mistakes. They were about creating a new path forward, one that would harmonize with the planet and respect the delicate balance of life. The world's leaders, once divided on how to approach the Alari's gift, now found common ground. There was a shared understanding that the future of humanity depended on their ability to work together. The first steps were taken toward creating a new global infrastructure, one that would use the Alari's technology in a way that respected the natural world. The world's largest cities began to transition to renewable energy sources, using the Alari's advanced power systems to reduce their carbon footprints. This wasn't just about replacing old technologies. It was about creating a new way of living, one that didn't consume the Earth's resources without considering the consequences. But the shift wasn't without its challenges. Many industries had to change, and change always comes with resistance. Fossil fuel companies, which had once held immense power, were now faced with the reality that their influence was waning. There were protests, arguments, and even violent clashes as old power structures fought to maintain their grip on the world's resources. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when it seemed like humanity might fall back into old habits. But the lessons of the Alari were too powerful to ignore, and in time the tide began to turn. One of the most profound changes was in agriculture. The Alari's knowledge allowed humanity to create new farming techniques that didn't rely on harmful pesticides or large-scale monoculture farming. They developed sustainable farming methods that restored the soil and preserved biodiversity. The new agricultural systems were designed to be in harmony with the natural world, ensuring that future generations would have access to healthy food without depleting the planet's resources. The Alari's archive also revealed new medical technologies that had the potential to revolutionize healthcare. The discovery of advanced treatments for diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries, such as cancer and Alzheimer's, brought a wave of hope. People began to see that the knowledge from the Alari wasn't just about survival, it was about improving the quality of life. The advancements in medicine were carefully integrated into healthcare systems around the world, ensuring that they were accessible to all, not just the wealthy. Despite the positive changes, there was still a lingering fear. The Alari had warned humanity about the dangers of becoming too reliant on technology, and some wondered whether they were doing just that. There were those who feared that humanity would lose touch with what it meant to be human, that technology would eventually overtake their lives in ways that were uncontrollable. Would they become so dependent on the Alari's advances that they would forget how to live without them? This fear was most pronounced among a group of thinkers who began to question whether humanity was truly learning from the Alari's story. They argued that by embracing the Alari's technology so wholeheartedly, humanity might be repeating the very mistakes the Alari had made. Were they sacrificing their humanity in the pursuit of technological perfection? It was a debate that grew louder, and there were no easy answers. To address these concerns, a new movement emerged, one that called for the careful integration of technology with human values. They didn't want to reject the Alari's gift, but they did want to ensure that it was used in a way that preserved the essence of humanity. This movement called for a world where technology and nature could coexist, where progress didn't come at the cost of the human experience. They pushed for a future where the best of technology could be used to enhance human life, but where humanity would never lose sight of what truly mattered: compassion, connection, and the ability to live in harmony with the world around them. The years passed. The integration of the Alari's technology began to show real results. Cities became cleaner, healthier, and more sustainable. The air was fresher, the water cleaner, and the food healthier. Diseases that once seemed insurmountable were now treatable, and new scientific discoveries continued to unfold as humanity dug deeper into the Alari's archive. The world was not perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. Yet, even as humanity flourished, The Alari's warning about the dangers of hubris continued to resonate. The living archive had provided humanity with an incredible opportunity, but it was clear that the future still held unknown challenges. The balance that the Alari had failed to maintain was something that humanity would have to be vigilant about. They had learned from the past, but that didn't guarantee the future. The real test was whether humanity could continue to balance progress with preservation, technology with nature. In the final stages of the Alari project, a massive global summit was called to address these ongoing concerns. Scientists, environmentalists, philosophers, and everyday citizens came together to discuss how humanity could continue to use the Alari's knowledge while staying true to the principles of sustainability and human well-being. It was an unprecedented gathering, one that marked a turning point in the way the world thought about the future. At the summit, Elsie Navarro, who had been instrumental in helping humanity understand the Alari's message, stood before the crowd. She had spent years working alongside her team to ensure that the Alari's knowledge was used for the greater good. But she knew that the journey was far from over. The world was still in the early stages of what would be a long process of transformation. Standing at the podium, Elsie spoke to the crowd. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But we're not there yet. The Alari gave us a gift, but that gift comes with a responsibility. We've seen what happens when a civilization doesn't respect the balance of nature. We've seen what happens when technology is used without wisdom. Now it's our turn to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes. The Alari didn't fail because they didn't have the answers. They failed because they didn't understand the questions. They didn't understand that progress must always be accompanied by humility." Her words struck a chord with the audience. It wasn't just about using technology. It was about using it with wisdom, with an understanding of its impact on the world. Humanity had the knowledge, but now they had to ensure that they used it wisely. As the summit came to a close, the world left with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about solving problems. It was about creating a new kind of future, one where technology and nature could coexist in harmony. The lessons of the Alari were not just warnings, they were guiding principles. Humanity had been given a second chance, and it was up to them to make sure that they didn't waste it. The years that followed were marked by a quiet optimism. The world was far from perfect, but it was on a better path. People were more connected to the environment, more aware of the impact of their actions, and more committed to creating a future that was sustainable and compassionate. The Alari's knowledge, once a symbol of the unknown, had become a powerful tool for positive change. And while humanity had made incredible strides, they knew the work was never truly done. They were always learning, always adapting, always striving to find that balance between progress and preservation. The Alari had given them the keys to a better future, but it was up to humanity to unlock the door. The story of the Alari wasn't just a tale of alien technology or an advanced civilization. It was a story of hope, of learning from the past, and of finding a way to create a future that respected both the Earth and the people who lived on it. It was a story that would be remembered for generations, not as a cautionary tale, but as a story of redemption and the power of collective wisdom. In this final part of the story, humanity has learned the true meaning of the Alari's gift: responsibility. They face the challenges of integrating advanced technology while remaining mindful of the environment and their values. The lessons of the Alari, combined with humanity's own drive for sustainability and progress, pave the way for a new future, one where technology serves the greater good, and where the mistakes of the past are not forgotten, but used to build a better world.